In the vast expanse of the Milky Way, where countless species vied for dominance and resources, humanity had carved out a reputation for itself. Not through diplomatic finesse or technological superiority, mind you, but through sheer, unadulterated stubbornness and an apparent inability to grasp the concept of staying down when you're supposed to be dead. It was almost as if humans had collectively decided that the Grim Reaper was more of a polite suggestion than an actual enforcer of mortality. Enter the Galactic Confederation's latest headache, a joint military operation between the highly esteemed Zentari Marines and their newly inducted human counterparts. The mission? To quell a particularly nasty uprising on the frontier world of Nexus 9. The problem? Well, let's just say that the Zentari were about to get a crash course in human tenacity, with a side order of what the actual fuck. Commander Zix Thor, a seasoned veteran of the Zentari forces, stood on the bridge of the assault carrier, unyielding claw, his antennae twitching with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He'd heard stories about these humans, tales that seemed too absurd to be true. But here he was, about to lead a mixed squad into battle alongside these Deathworlders. Status report, Zix Thor barked, his mandibles clicking in agitation. Lieutenant Crevier, his second in command, quickly responded, "All systems nominal, Commander. The human contingent is preparing in their own unique way." Zix Thor's compound eyes narrowed. "Elaborate, Lieutenant." Crevier's exoskeleton seemed to pale slightly. "Well, sir, they appear to be engaging in some sort of pre-battle ritual. They're consuming large quantities of a stimulant beverage they call coffee and laughing about their potential demise." The commander's antennae drooped in disbelief. "They're laughing about dying? Are you certain your universal translator isn't malfunctioning?" "I wish it were," Sir Crevier replied, her voice a mix of awe and horror. "One of them just said, and I quote, 'If I die out there, make sure to delete my browser history.' The others found this hilarious." Zix Thor chittered in exasperation. "Galaxies preserve us. Very well, let's get this over with. Prepare for planetary insertion." As the assault carrier breached Nexus 9's atmosphere, the mixed squad of Zentari and human Marines gathered in the deployment bay. The contrast between the two species couldn't have been more stark. The Zentari stood in perfect formation, their chitinous armor gleaming, weapons held at precise angles. The humans, on the other hand, looked like they'd just rolled out of bed after a 3-day bender and decided to crash an intergalactic kegger. Sergeant Sarah Boom Boom Rodriguez, the human squad leader, sauntered up to Zix Thor, a steaming mug of coffee in one hand and a truly alarming number of grenades strapped to her combat vest. "Morning, Commander," she chirped, far too cheerfully for someone about to dive into a war zone. "Beautiful day for some good old-fashioned ass-kicking, don't you think?" Zix Thor's mandibles twitched in what passed for a Zentari grimace. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I must remind you that this is a serious military operation, not a, what do you humans call it? A kegger." Sarah snorted, nearly choking on her coffee. "Oh, don't worry your pretty little antennae, Commander. We're taking this very seriously." See, she gestured to her squad, who were in various states of caffeination and weapon checking. "Private Johnson over there is so serious, he's contemplating the meaning of life while polishing his combat knife." The commander looked over to see the aforementioned Private Johnson indeed staring intently at a wickedly sharp blade, muttering something about 42 and thanks for all the fish. Before Zix Thor could formulate a response that didn't involve questioning his life choices, the ship's AI announced their imminent landing. With a bone-jarring thud, the assault carrier touched down on the war-torn surface of Nexus 9. As the deployment bay doors hissed open, the acrid smell of smoke and ozone assaulted their senses. The battlefield stretched out before them, a hellscape of ruined buildings and cratered streets. In the distance, the staccato of gunfire and the dull thump of explosions provided a constant, ominous soundtrack. "Well, ain't this just a little slice of paradise?" Sarah quipped, tossing her empty coffee mug aside with casual disregard. "All right, ladies and gentle bugs, let's go introduce ourselves to the neighborhood. I hear they're just dying to meet us." With that, she vaulted over the safety barrier and charged into the fray, her squad hot on her heels, whooping and hollering like they were storming the beaches of spring break rather than a hostile alien world. Zix Thor watched in stunned silence for a moment before shaking himself out of his stupor. "Zentari Marines, advance," he commanded, leading his troops into battle with considerably more decorum. The next few hours were a chaos of firefights, close-quarters combat, and increasingly creative human expletives that had the Zentari's universal translators working overtime and occasionally shorting out in protest. As they pushed deeper into enemy territory, Zixthor found himself reluctantly impressed by the humans' combat effectiveness. What they lacked in discipline and formation, they more than made up for in sheer adaptability and a seemingly endless capacity for violence. He watched in fascination as Private Johnson, cornered by 3 insurgents, proceeded to take them out using nothing but a combat knife, a piece of rubble, and what appeared to be a half-eaten protein bar. The private emerged from the skirmish covered in alien blood and grinning like a maniac. "Did you see that?" Sarge Johnson called out, waving his knife triumphantly. "I went all MacGyver on their asses." Sarah, in the middle of lobbing a grenade into a bunker, shouted back, less bragging, more stabbing, "Johnson, we've got a quota to meet." Zixthor's mandibles clicked in confusion. "Quota? I don't recall establishing any sort of numerical objective for enemy neutralization." Sarah paused in her grenade throwing long enough to flash him a wicked grin. "Oh, it's not an official quota, Commander. We just like to keep things interesting. Makes for better stories at the bar later, you know." Before Zixthor could point out the numerous regulations such an attitude violated, a series of explosions rocked the battlefield. The air was suddenly filled with the whine of incoming artillery. "Incoming!" Crevier shouted, diving for cover behind a crumbling wall. The Zentari Marines, trained to perfection, smoothly took up defensive positions. The humans, on the other hand, seemed to take the barrage as a personal challenge. "Oh, so that's how they want to play it," Sarah growled, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling mix of fury and excitement. "All right, boys and girls, time to show these xenopunks why you don't mess with the descendants of cockroaches and Keith Richards." To Zixthor's horror and amazement, the humans charged towards the source of the artillery fire, zigzagging through the hail of explosions with a combination of skill and what he could only assume was blind, stupid luck. "Are they insane?" Crevier asked, her voice pitched high with disbelief. Zixthor, watching Sarah redirect an incoming shell with the flat of her combat shovel, a move that defied several laws of physics, could only shake his head. "I'm beginning to think that insanity might be a prerequisite for their species' survival." As if to prove his point, Private Johnson came sprinting past, cackling maniacally as he dual-wielded what appeared to be a pair of alien weapons he'd scavenged from the battlefield. "Hey, Sarge, I don't know what these do, but they make a really cool pew-pew sound." Sarah, in the middle of clotheslining an enemy combatant, shouted back, "That's great, Johnson. Just try not to vaporize yourself this time." That was one time Johnson protested, before disappearing into the smoke of battle, the sound of unfamiliar energy weapons and his own laughter echoing behind him. Zixthor turned to his second-in-command, Mandibles Agape. This time, Crevier could only shrug helplessly. "Perhaps it's best not to ask, sir." As the battle raged on, the combined forces of Zentari precision and human chaos slowly but surely pushed back the insurgents. Zixthor found himself adapting to the humans' unorthodox tactics, even begrudgingly admitting to himself, at least, that their unpredictability was a valuable asset. It was in the final push towards the insurgent stronghold that everything went sideways. As they approached the heavily fortified building, a hidden sniper opened fire from a concealed position. Time seemed to slow as Zixthor watched the high-energy bolt streak across the battlefield. His compound eyes widened in horror as he realized its trajectory led straight to Sergeant Rodriguez, who was too focused on directing her squad to notice the imminent danger. "Sergeant, look out," he shouted, but it was too late. The bolt struck Sarah square in the chest, punching through her armor like it was made of paper. The force of the impact sent her flying backward, her body slamming into a pile of rubble with a sickening crunch. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent. Even the insurgents seemed to pause, as if in recognition of a fallen warrior. Zixthor felt a wave of regret wash over him. Despite their differences, he had come to respect the human sergeant's bravery and leadership. He opened his mandibles to order a retreat and recovery of her body when the impossible happened. With a groan that sounded more annoyed than pained, Sarah Rodriguez sat up. The Zentari Marines froze, their perfect discipline shattered by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. The human soldiers, on the other hand, barely seemed to register it as unusual. "Oh, hell," Sarah grumbled. looking down at the smoking hole in her chest with an expression of mild irritation. I just got this armor broken in too. She staggered to her feet, swaying slightly but somehow remaining upright. Blood seeped from her wound, staining her combat fatigues a dark crimson. Zixthor's mandibles worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. Sergeant Rodriguez, you need immediate medical attention. That wound is fatal. Sarah glanced down at her chest again, as if she'd forgotten about the gaping hole where most of her vital organs should have been. Hey, I've had worse. Besides, she added with a grin that was equal parts pain and manic glee, I'm not dead yet, which means I've still got some fight left in me. To the utter disbelief of every non-human on the battlefield, Sarah hefted her rifle and started advancing on the enemy position. Come on, you ugly bastards, she roared, her voice somehow even louder and more intimidating than before. You call that a killing shot? My grandma hits harder than that, and she's been dead for 20 years. The human squad, apparently unfazed by their leader's brush with death, rallied around her with renewed vigor. Private Johnson, still wielding his mystery alien weapons, let out a war cry that sounded suspiciously like the chorus to Another One Bites the Dust. Zixthor, his tactical mind warring with his understanding of basic biology, made a decision. Zintari Marines, advance. Support Sergeant Rodriguez's assault. As they pushed forward, Zixthor found himself fighting alongside Sarah. Despite the grievous wound, she fought with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural. Every movement should have been agony, every breath a struggle, and yet she seemed to draw strength from her very pain. How Zixthor began, his voice filled with awe and not a little fear. How are you still fighting? Sarah turned to him, her face pale from blood loss but her eyes burning with an inner fire. Simple, Commander. I decided I'm not going to die today. Death's gonna have to try a lot harder than this if it wants to take me out. She punctuated her statement by headbutting an insurgent who had gotten too close, dropping him like a sack of potatoes. Besides, she added with a wink, I've got a date with that cute medic back on the carrier, and I'd hate to stand her up. The final assault on the stronghold was a blur of plasma fire, explosions, and increasingly creative uses of improvised weapons. At one point, Zixthor distinctly remembered seeing Private Johnson riding an enemy hover tank like a rodeo bull, screaming yippee-ki-yay. As he reprogrammed its targeting systems with nothing but a multi-tool, and what the human insisted was the power of positive thinking. Through it all, Sarah Rodriguez led the charge, a blood-soaked Valkyrie who seemed to become more unstoppable with each passing moment. The insurgents, faced with this unkillable juggernaut and her equally insane compatriots, began to falter. It was Sarah who finally breached the stronghold's command center, kicking down the reinforced door with a boot thrust that, by all rights, should have shattered every bone in her leg. Instead, the door flew off its hinges, crushing the unfortunate insurgent leader who had been standing behind it. As the dust settled and the last pockets of resistance were mopped up, Zixthor found Sarah sitting on the broken remains of the insurgent leader's chair, casually field dressing her own wound with supplies scavenged from a first aid kit. Well, that was fun, she said, looking up at the Zintari commander with a grin that was only slightly delirious from blood loss. Same time next week. Zixthor's antennae drooped in a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. Sergeant Rodriguez, I don't understand. By all accounts, you should be dead. That wound. Sarah waved a hand dismissively, wincing slightly at the movement. Oh, this little thing? PFFT. It's just a flesh wound. Nothing a little duct tape and some antibiotics can't fix. But your vital organs. They're overrated anyway, she quipped, then laughed at Zixthor's horrified expression. Relax, Commander. Human bodies are tougher than you'd think. We've got this neat little trick called adrenaline that lets us ignore things like mortal wounds and common sense when we need to. Private Johnson, who had materialized next to them with an armful of alien tech that he had absolutely no business possessing, chimed in. Plus, Sarge here is too stubborn to die. Death's gonna take one look at her medical history and go, nah, I'll come back later. Zixthor looked between the two humans, his compound eyes narrowing. You're joking, right? This is one of your human pranks. Sarah and Johnson exchanged a look, then burst into laughter, which quickly turned into a pained wheeze on Sarah's part. Oh man, Sarah gasped, clutching her chest. I wish we were joking. Nah, Commander. This is just another Tuesday for us. Although she added, her voice taking on a slightly woozy quality, I think I might actually need that medic now. Starting to feel a bit lightheaded. As if on cue, Sarah's eyes rolled back, and she slumped in the chair, finally succumbing to her injuries now that the danger had passed. Thor snapped into action, barking orders for immediate medical evacuation. As they waited for the med team to arrive, he found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about humans and warfare. These Deathworlders, with their impossible resilience and complete disregard for the conventional rules of combat and biology, were unlike anything he had ever encountered. They were chaotic, unpredictable. And utterly terrifying. And yet Thor couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for their sheer tenacity and will to survive. As the medical team rushed in, their antennae twitching with barely contained panic at the sight of Sarah's wounds, Thor found himself chuckling. It was a sound that startled his troops, who had never heard their commander express amusement in such a manner. Sir Lieutenant Cree VA approached cautiously, her exoskeleton still bearing scorch marks from the recent battle. "Are you laughing?" Thor composed himself, his mandibles clicking in what passed for a Zentari smile. "Indeed, Lieutenant. I find myself amused by the absurdity of our situation. We came here expecting to teach these humans how to wage war properly. Instead, I believe they've taught us a valuable lesson." Crevier's antennae twitched in confusion. "A lesson, sir? What could we possibly learn from such chaos?" The commander gestured to the bustling human soldiers, who were now engaged in a spirited debate over who had the coolest battle scar. "Look at them, Crevier. By all rights, they should be traumatized, shell-shocked, or at the very least exhausted. And yet here they are, laughing in the face of death itself. They possess a resilience that goes beyond mere physical endurance. It's as if their very spirits refuse to be broken." Private Johnson, overhearing their conversation, sauntered over with a grin that seemed entirely too wide for someone who had just survived a near-apocalyptic battle. "Aw, shucks, Commander. You're gonna make us blush. We're just doing what comes naturally, kicking ass and taking names. And maybe collecting a few souvenirs along the way." He patted a bulging satchel that clinked ominously with what Thor strongly suspected were purloined alien artifacts. Before Thor could admonish the private for his blatant disregard of regulations regarding the handling of unknown technology, a commotion from the medical team drew their attention. "By the Hive Queen's eggs," one of the medics exclaimed, his multiple arms waving in agitation. She's conscious." Sure enough, Sarah Rodriguez was not only awake but attempting to sit up, much to the horror of the medical staff trying to treat her. "Come on, Doc," she grumbled, swatting away a probing instrument with surprising strength for someone who should, by all rights, be on death's door. "It's just a scratch. Slap some meaty gel on it and let me get back to work. We've still got a planet to secure, you know." Thor hurried over, his exoskeleton clattering with each step. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you must rest. Your injuries are severe, and—" Sarah cut him off with a snort that turned into a pained cough. "Severe? Please. I once finished a marathon with a ruptured appendix and 3 broken toes. This is nothing." The Zentari commander's compound eyes blinked rapidly as he processed this information. You ran a marathon with internal injuries and fractured bones. Why would you do such a thing?" "For the t-shirt, of course," Sarah replied with a grin, as if it were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. "And bragging rights. Mostly bragging rights." One of the medics, a young Zentari barely out of his larval stage, chittered nervously. "Commander, I don't understand. Our scans show massive internal trauma, severe blood loss, and at least 3 fractures. By all medical science, she shouldn't even be conscious, let alone talking and making jokes." Sarah's grin widened, taking on an almost predatory quality. "Welcome to the wonderful world of human biology, kid. We're like those inflatable punching bags you knock down, we just keep popping back up." Private Johnson, never one to miss an opportunity to add to the chaos, chimed in. "Yeah, and Sarge here, she's like one of those punching bags but filled with concrete and pure, distilled badassery." Thor, feeling a headache building behind his complex eyes, held up a hand to silence the enthusiastic private. "Sergeant Rodriguez, while I admire your resilience, I must insist that you allow the medical team to do their job. That's an order." For a moment it looked like Sarah might argue, but then, perhaps finally feeling the full weight of her injuries, she slumped back onto the medical stretcher with a resigned sigh. Fine. But I expect a full debrief once I'm out of surgery. And someone better save me some of that weird blue booze we found in the insurgent leader's private stash." As the medical team whisked Sarah away, chittering frantically among themselves about human physiology and the apparent uselessness of their xenobiology textbooks, Zix-Thor turned to address the remaining human soldiers. I must commend you all on your performance today," he began, feeling slightly out of his element. "Zentari were not known for their inspirational speeches. Your tactics were unorthodox, your methods bordering on insanity, and your disregard for personal safety was deeply concerning. And yet, I cannot argue with the results." The humans beamed with pride, as if being called insane was the highest compliment they could receive, which Zix-Thor reflected it probably was. However, he continued, his tone growing stern, "I must insist that in future operations you refrain from— what did you call it? Yeeting live grenades at each other as some sort of warm-up exercise." Private Johnson had the decency to look slightly abashed. "All of you, come on, Commander. It improves our reflexes." "It also nearly gave our demolitions expert a nervous breakdown," Zix-Thor retorted. "I'm fairly certain I saw him trying to tender his resignation by writing it on the side of an unexploded ordnance." The human soldiers erupted into laughter, slapping each other on the back and trading stories of their most outrageous moments from the battle. Zix-Thor watched them with a mixture of admiration and trepidation, realizing that his life and quite possibly the future of galactic warfare would never be the same. As the laughter died down, a young human corporal approached Zix-Thor, her eyes shining with a mixture of respect and mischief. "So, Commander," she said, rocking back and forth on her heels, "what did you think of your first real battle alongside Earth's finest?" Zix-Thor considered the question carefully, his antennae twitching as he formulated his response. "It was enlightening," he finally said, "and terrifying, and utterly incomprehensibly human." The corporal grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment." "As you should," Zix-Thor replied, surprising himself with the warmth in his voice. "I believe I speak for all Zentari when I say that we are grateful to have you as allies. Though perhaps we should revisit some of our joint training protocols. Clearly our current methods are not comprehensive enough." Private Johnson, who had been attempting to juggle several alien energy cells much to the horror of the nearby Zentari engineers, perked up at this. "Ooh, does this mean we get to teach you guys how to properly improvise in the field? Because let me tell you, I've got some great ideas involving duct tape, a toaster, and just a smidge of weapons-grade plutonium." No, Zix-Thor interrupted, his voice rising an octave in panic. "I mean, perhaps we should start with something simpler, like proper equipment maintenance or meditation techniques for stress management." The humans exchanged glances, clearly trying not to laugh at the idea of meditation being more useful than duct tape and plutonium in a combat situation. As Zix-Thor watched the humans continue their post-battle celebrations, trading increasingly outrageous stories and comparing battle scars, he felt a profound shift in his understanding of the universe. These Deathworlders, with their fragile-looking bodies and their complete disregard for the laws of probability, had managed to do what no other species had done in millennia of Zentari military history. They had surprised him. They had adapted faster, fought harder, and survived against odds that should have been impossible. And they had done it all with a grin on their faces and a quip on their lips. In that moment, Zix-Thor made a decision. He would recommend to the Galactic Confederation that humanity be given a more prominent role in their joint military operations. Not because of their advanced technology or superior tactics, but because of their sheer, unbridled audacity and their ability to turn certain defeat into improbable victory. Of course, he would also recommend tripling the budget for medical supplies, increasing the insurance premiums for any ships carrying human crews, and possibly investing in some sort of reinforced containment units for particularly enthusiastic human soldiers during non-combat hours. As if reading his thoughts, Lieutenant Crevier approached, her exoskeleton still bearing the scorch marks from the recent battle. "Your orders, sir?" Zix-Thor straightened, his mandibles set in a determined click. "Prepare a full report for High Command. And perhaps requisition some of that coffee the humans are so fond of. I have a feeling we're going to need it." Crevier's antennae twitched in what might have been amusement. "Understood, sir. And what should I tell them about Sergeant Rodriguez's condition?" The commander glanced towards the medical bay, where he could already hear the sounds of Sarah arguing with her doctors about the necessity of anesthesia. "Tell them," he paused, considering his words carefully. "Tell them that we have witnessed the impossible, and that the galaxy should prepare itself because humanity is just getting started." As Creva hurried off to prepare the report, Zix-Thor allowed himself a small chitter of laughter. The Galactic Confederation had no idea what they were in for. But one thing was certain: with humanity on their side, the enemies of peace didn't stand a chance. Even if the collateral damage might just reshape a few planets along the way.